Let's see. There they are, filing in. Just waiting a couple seconds for everybody to come on in, and we'll get this started. Thank you for coming. All right then. All right. So, well, hello and welcome to the second week of Whither Criticism, a look at some of the leading thought leaders on the role of criticism in critics in the built space. My name is Dan Evans. I'm a professor of journalism at Florida International University.
And I'm David Rifkind, a faculty member in the Department of Architecture. We've asked 6 current and former architecture critics to discuss the current state of the field and to offer their thoughts on how architecture criticism needs to adjust to respond to the major crises of our time. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome our second guest, Lee Bay. Lee Bay is a member of the Chicago Sun-Times editorial board, where he shapes the newspaper's position on a range of issues, including urban planning, land use, city government, and politics. He's also the former architecture critic for the Chicago Sun-Times. He's also a photographer, writer, consultant, and lecturer whose work deals in the documentation and interpretation of the built environment and the often complex political, social, and racial forces that shape spaces and places. Bay is the author of Southern Exposure, The Overlooked Architecture of Chicago's South Side, a book that showcases his architectural and social commentary and his architectural photography. An adjunct professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology College of Architecture, Bay teaches a class based on his book. The class examines how race shapes architecture and urban planning on Chicago's South Side and other communities of color across the country. Welcome, Lee Bay.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good to be here. And so I should just jump in, I guess, right?
Please.
All right. You know, and you know this because otherwise you wouldn't be having these talks. But what a critical time and an important time to have this kind of conversation. Because one of the most contested things that we face in this country these days, in addition to politics and other things, is space and who has the right to it, public space, and who does it belong to, and how long does it belong to whoever it belongs to, and what are the forces that that shape that. And I think, and I'll get into the story of myself and kind of how I fit into all this, but it's such an important time to have this conversation. And I think that anyone who's interested in writing about the built environment or reading quality writing about the built environment should be asking themselves these questions, or should be looking along or looking at writers and doing the writing themselves that kind of fits along these lines. They kind of ask these important questions about space and other things as well. So in my own career in architecture criticism, architecture writing is as loopy as it gets in terms of how I got there. I didn't take the traditional way, if there is a traditional way. I was a journalist, well, I still am a journalist, but I left the field and came back. We'll get into that. But my early part of my career was at the Chicago Sun-Times. And I was a general assignment reporter, worked up to a beat. My beat was education and then special projects, which was really great. And then, something weird happened. And, and sometimes life shapes our careers in ways that we don't intend or can't foresee. And that is, I was married at the time and had my second of 3 daughters. First daughter was born 2 years earlier, and the second daughter was born, almost to the day of the first daughter. And I was covering the trial of a congressman, Chicago, of course, so there's going to be some political corruption somewhere along the line. The trial of a congressman who had been discovered having an affair with an underage campaign worker. And he was about to be sentenced. And I was in court. I followed this story. My journalism partner, Maureen O'Donnell, and I had followed this story for 2 years. And he was about to be sentenced. And I was just ready for this thing to be over. And my pager, remember those beepers? pager went off, and it was the wife saying, "Come home, the baby's about to be born." So that caused a shift in a way, right? Did I want to, so I go home, and baby's, take the wife to the hospital, baby's born, I'm taking some time off, but during that time, it got me to thinking, do I want to spend? Are we having audio problems?
Sorry,
Sure.
I just messed it up.
There you go. You fixed yourself there. But you're muted. You're muted. Oh. That's good.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. So long story short, I had some time off, and during that time off from work, I was curious. I wanted to change. And when I got back to work, we had an editor who was new from London, actually, and he wanted to start an architecture beat. And I just asked for it. I didn't think I'd get it. I didn't have much training in architecture, but I was a good writer, and I knew the city. I was always interested in the political forces that shaped preservation and kind of decided what got built and what didn't get built. So that with that, I became the paper's architecture critic with just a stroke of a pen, if you will. And this would be around 1996. And it was a critical time in Chicago's history because built environment, at least the history of the built environment, because money was really beginning to flow through Chicago in ways it hadn't in the previous 15 years. So skyscrapers are going up, public works that were long stalled were being released and being worked on and being executed. And I was right in the middle of it. The interesting thing about it is that the Sun-Times, is one of two papers in Chicago, right? The Tribune, the more traditional broadsheet, and then the Sun-Times has always been like the scrappy tabloid, smart tabloid. The idea was figuring out what architecture criticism would look like to that audience. I mean, we had this sort of traditional critic, Blair Kamen, who was fantastic, but the city didn't need two Blair Kamens. So the idea was, nor did it need two Lee Bays for that matter, if it got to that. So the idea was to shape and figure out and shape what the reportage, what the criticism would be for this audience, which were, cops, bartenders, people from the neighborhood like me and others. And that made it fun because it made me not write about so much the latest downtown project, right? Latest skyscraper, but it made me go out into the neighborhoods, which is where I'm from, and write about preservation issues and parks preservation and all these kind of things. And it opened up an interesting area. I mean, we kind of take it for granted now. The papers do that, and blogs and other architecture criticism does that now. But 25 years ago, it wasn't done quite as much. I mean, there was who's the critic who passed away out of Dallas some years ago, the Dallas architecture critic, name just escaped me. My goodness, I'm sorry. But he had some architecture critics who did that kind of work, but by and large, not so much so. So the people I talked to were, that you'd find in my stories were the people who were affected by, a building being demolished or not being preserved, a city plan coming into an area when the people there don't necessarily want it, but City Hall says yes, they have to kind of deal with it. So there was that in the mix. And then there was also, because Chicago is Chicago is, politics, we debate politics like we debate sports and weather here. The idea that it would be infused, the coverage would be infused with this sense of, or this awareness of the political forces in and around Chicago that decide what building gets built, what doesn't get built, what gets preserved, what doesn't get preserved. So long story short, I mean, the coverage was less about a beauty contest of a building, although occasionally, you do it, you have to do it, but more about the forces that shape the building. Who said what to whom? How much power does the mayor have? Which leads to the other thing. Richard M. Daley, was mayor during those times, immensely powerful mayor. And at the time that I was writing about architecture, he's about at the height of his powers. He was mayor for 22 years. And And literally, he was the go-to guy. He was the literal thumbs up and thumbs down on whether a project got built, what it looked like, or everything. So being able to know that and have sources in City Hall, an architecture critic, City Hall sources, like I had back in my hard news reporting days, was the way to go. I had a great time. I spent 5 years as architecture critic, and then oddly enough, I get hired by the mayor, by Mayor Daley, to be deputy chief of staff. Christopher Hawthorne kind of has a similar role now out in LA, went from architecture critic to a city official. So I did it in 2001, and it was fun. I mean, as a journalist, we always think we know how a city runs, and we do, but not until you work for it. Do you really get a chance to see where all the bones are, and how the deals get cut? The biggest projects there for me was the redo of Soldier Field. We were talking about football before we came on. I mean, Soldier Field is the Park District owned stadium that the Bears play in. It built in 1909 and was falling apart. And the idea was to put a new seating bowl inside the existing 1909 stadium, which was controversial because it looked like a spaceship to most people. But it was a good run, and I got a chance again to learn a lot more, but also get a chance to learn about what we're talking about with this conversation. That it's more than writing about the aesthetics of a building. It's or a place or new development, but really it's about a sense of how it impacts people. Literally how it impacts a neighborhood. Those kind of things become really an important part of the conversation. I began to learn more there. Did 3 years at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, advising the Chicago office of SOM on government. Went from playing offense to defense, right? Went from there to heading a group called the Chicago Central Area Committee, which was a group, a downtown business group of bankers and utility executives and the like, who were concerned about architecture in Chicago. That was what my daughters now call the suit and tie job, right? Because it was very much a very formal thing, and we had access, and you really get a chance to see who has access and who doesn't, and when it comes to the built environment in Chicago. But to jump forward without making this an hour-long conversation, I got all along I still wrote. I wrote pieces for magazine pieces, mostly. Photography became kind of interesting to me because I originally got a camera. See if I got it here with me. I bought this old camera in 96, right after my second daughter was born, and before my third daughter was born, 95. Sorry, it's dusty, because I like the way it looked. I like 50s architecture and design, right? So this is an old Argus camera made right here in Des Plaines, Illinois. And I bought it because it looked, and because I wanted to photograph my daughters growing up. Takes film, right? And because I was around buildings so much as I was around the kids, actually, I started photographing buildings, and somehow the two got together. The writing got better, and the photography improved my writing, and then the writing in turn returned the favor to the photography. And I began to sort of put them together as time went on. Most recently, I'm back at the Sun-Times on the editorial board, where I do write about urban planning issues and other issues as well. But I guess the big thing, of course, is Southern Exposure, which is my book, The Overlooked Architecture of Chicago's South Side. This book really kind of does what I, think the best of my architecture criticism career does, and what I think, hopefully, the best of my current writing for the Sun-Times does, is that it fully synthesizes the story of the built environment, whatever it may be, a school, whatever, but it has enough of the history and backstory there. Let me just back up a bit and tell it very plainly. So the book makes two arguments, at least, that the South Side of Chicago is contains the most the best architecture in Chicago outside of downtown, but that it's overlooked, and that it's largely overlooked because the South Side of Chicago is predominantly Black, and the South Side of Chicago also has, and I live on the South Side still, also has issues with crime and disinvestment, and so the book didn't want to shy away from that, but it wanted to explain through an architecture critic's lens why that happened, why the disinvestment happened, the effects of the disinvestment on the communities that we see, and how it places these critical and beautiful buildings at risk. And then also it's a bit of a memoir as well, so it's a little bit of everything in there. And then it's sort of a call to the future and to the present, telling the mayor, who was just elected, our new mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who literally was just elected 2 months before the book came out, 3 months before the book came out, saying that now's the time for bold moves on the South Side. And I even say, I think it still made the cut, that the other South Sides around America, that it's time for a bold move in terms of thinking and reimagining these places, not in a way that displaces the people who are there, but in a way that there's an analogy in the book that the disinvestment that happens in places like, South Side of Chicago, the West Side of Chicago, parts of Detroit, almost all of Detroit, and all these places, that would happen to them through redlining and other kind of nefarious things like that. I liken it to a robbery, right? Where wealth was sort of snatched from these communities and never allowed to build in these communities because of things that the FHA did, banks, insurance companies, all conspiring to devalue these areas. And we still live with that to this day. And that the way to reinvest in these neighborhoods is to invest to the tune that they were stolen from. And it's going to be expensive and painful, but necessary. What we're finding out in this George Floyd moment very much is that cities like Chicago and countries like America, we can't have two Americas, we can't have two Chicagos. The buildings become the example of that oftentimes. You see an American Foursquare in Inglewood in Chicago, in the Inglewood neighborhood on the South Side, and it's a wreck. And we see the same one in Andersonville on the North Side, and it's beautiful. And we say, well, that's because Black people tore it up. That's why the one in Inglewood is a wreck, and the one that is in Andersonville it isn't. And then the book, and then what we're seeing with with all of the kind of agitation that's coming out this summer, is that there are other reasons why this is happening. Again, the disinvestment. Our public radio station, WBEZ, did a piece earlier this summer, which was eye-opening, which talked about the way home loans are made in Chicago. And of course, this directly impacts the built environment, right? How banks lend directly impacts the built environment. And it found, among other things, that Chase Bank, the nation's largest bank, might be the world's largest bank for all I know, certainly is Chicago's largest bank, made more loans in one neighborhood, Lincoln Park, predominantly white upper class neighborhood just north of downtown. It made more loans, more mortgage loans and home improvement loans over a 10-year span recently in that one neighborhood than it did throughout the entire South Side of Chicago. And David, you'll dig this. I mean, the South Side of Chicago is as big as Philadelphia in terms of square acres, square miles. It's exactly as big as Philadelphia, actually. So this one neighborhood, one of 77 neighborhoods, got more loans from this bank, and the others were just as bad, than the entirety, than a city, essentially, within the city. These are the things I think that architecture critic and architecture criticism, these are the things you have to start putting in your bag now to write about. Again, you can't write about finials and cornices and superficially about walkability. If we're going to be talking about these communities, this post-Floyd period, and even the communities that are successful, we have to talk about that robbery or explain how that robbery affects what we see and what we don't see. Just very briefly, I mean, one of the things that I think was astounding to me in this sort of period that I'm writing the book is how culpable architecture and urban planning, what an accessory, if you will, architecture and urban planning has been to some of the racist and oppressive things that have happened in America. I was down in Montgomery, Alabama 2 years ago, I think 2 years ago, for Architect Magazine, writing about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the anti-lynching memorial. And me and Brian Stevenson, the boss of it all down there, head of the Equal Justice Initiative, we spent a lot of time around this table talking the 3 days I was down there. And I said that, and again, as I conclude this, that I was struck when I got to town to write the piece, because I land in Montgomery, and I'm on a street called Commerce, right? And as I'm walking down the street, I'm noticing the signs, and I'm doing some history when I get home, that Commerce Street, the main commercial activity for that street when it was built was the slave trade. And the street was built, it's like, gosh, I can't think of the street before, but it's like a typical street like Michigan Avenue in Chicago, or to some extent, boulevard, right? Urban boulevard, or commercial boulevard. And it was made for this to happen. The enslaved people would come up and dock, by ship at the Alabama River, which was at the foot of the street. They would march up the street. They would pass warehouses and hotels and banks that were all devoted to the slave trade. And then they walk about a mile or thereabout to the town square, which is directly on access to the state capitol, which old timers like me remember reading about George Wallace, in the 60s, making his segregation now, segregation forever speech there. But so the slave trade is not happening like in back alleys, like dope deals are, right? Or behind. It's on their Michigan Avenue. It's on their Broadway, right? They're not shy about it, and the street is built and contoured this way. And now, 150 years later, many of the buildings still remain. Ironically, Brian Stevenson's Institute is still there. But we talked about how the street was perfected as a boulevard. And it works today very beautiful, very well as a boulevard, but it was perfected as a boulevard to facilitate the slave trade. So I know there's a lot of stuff that I covered there, but I'd like to maybe open the floor up perhaps, and we could talk about the role of the critic and anything else you want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Lee. We do have a lot of questions, especially about moving forward. I know I have a lot of questions. And I guess, well, the first one I want to start with is what you've just been talking about, because also the way that you've been talking about disinvestment and the need for reinvestment, it's very consonant with a lot of the discussions, contemporary discussions about reparations and how that would be structured as a broad public policy. But how do you see architecture, landscape architecture, urban design? How do you see design fields as part of that process, essentially that process of reparations?
I think that what those professions can do is it can help those, whether it's policymakers or enlightened developers, you can help bring about solutions that work, right? I mean, if we were to say that urban planners were the handmaidens to the bad parts of urban renewal back in the 60s and 70s. And that's bad, right? That was a bad thing, then the opposite could be true as well. That as we get to this more enlightened age, and I'm proud of the students that I teach at IIT, because they're there in terms of wanting to make for themselves a better world. I'm sure the same is there too. There's an awareness that's there that probably even wasn't there when I was in college in the 80s. That certainly wasn't there when I was in college in the 80s. And I think that that's the role. I'll give you a good example. Helmut Jahn, right? World famous architect here in Chicago. 20 years ago, I went to Berlin to write about Sony Center, his big project there at Potsdamer Platz there. And I interviewed him before I left. And so, because I'm going to be there for the opening, but he's not. And so he tells me, we're talking about the building and everything. And then he says, well, you know, when you go, you know, there's some space there that looks like public space. It looks like a park, but it isn't. It's private. And he says, and I had a hell of a time getting the developers, the owners, not to gate it off. Now, this is 2000, right? And he said that, you know, I said that that's wrong. You can't gate off. Helmut says it's wrong. You can't gate off the space. If it looks like a park, people are going to use it as a park. You can't gate it off. And he said, this is going to be one of the fights of this next decade or two. And he's right. Developers do build these kind of mega developments, whether it's Wilson Yards here or Lincoln Yards. There's so many of these yards. What's Hudson Yards in New York, and I think it's Wilson Yards and Lincoln Yards here. And they all have this park-like space that they negotiate, right, in order to get some of the incentives. But then when the thing gets built, all of a sudden it isn't quite as public as it seems. And I think that architects, urban planners can do what Helmut did and more in terms of making sure these spaces look and function and remain the way they should. That's just one aspect.
That's pretty cool. And actually I was thinking about something while you were, speaking about your book and the work that you've done in terms of the photography and, you know, seeing things on the South Side where you have lived so many years. And because of that, I'm wondering if you have any examples of a particular building, a structure, a park, and anything that you felt was particularly uplifting to the South Side community. And was there any, and on the flip side of that, was there any constructions you felt that was particularly repressive in some way that really tried to, either intentionally or not, to destroy the culture in some way? So was there anything that uplifted that you can remember that struck you, and anything that really kind of tried to push things down? And before you answer, I just want to make an announcement. Make sure the question and answer is certainly open. I know we have one question in there, and we'll certainly get to you, but please feel free to ask your question, and we will get to you as we can. So Lee.
Great question. You know, I was thinking maybe I could share an image with you, but I'm not quite adept enough to do that without cutting us all off. but in terms of a place I think uplift, well, you know what? We got some time. Give me 1 second. Let's see if I can do this, because I want to show you a place, if I can. Let's see here.
I think you should be able to share your screen.
All right. The question is whether I have the smarts to do it. Let's see here. Oh, hold on. I think I figured it out. Let's see here.
Zoom.
Well, I'll talk about it as we go. There is a kind of a hidden place. Actually, it was built in the 1880s, but I used to use it in lectures because it would stump even hardcore Southsiders. I would say, "Do you know where this is?" And they'd be mystified. It's a 2-block long lagoon that runs. It just appears out of nowhere. You're driving along 79th Street on the south side, and you let's see here. Maybe I found it. And you make a turn, and then you find this incredible almost oasis that's been there, for 100 years. And let's see. Can you guys see a blue bridge? Oops. Can you see? No? Can you see a blue? Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
I know what I did.
Yeah, there's a green button towards the middle, at least on my end, that says share screen, and there you go.
All right. You see the bridge?
No. Yeah. No, when you share the screen, I think it'll give you the options of which screen to share.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So the place I'm talking about is,
Ooh.
Oh, come on, get big, man. My computer's being slow. Well, it's gonna expand. Oh, here we go. So here's the place I'm talking about. So this street is called Winnicott Parkway, and this is looking east. I'm sorry, this is looking west, and this is looking east. And it just sort of drops itself down in the middle of Chicago street grid. You wouldn't know it was there unless you lived around here or took an odd turn like I did. And for years and years and years, I mean, this was built in the 1880s, begins to fall into disrepair as early as the 1930s. So you can't even blame black folks for that one. Daily News, Chicago Daily News has stories about the residents lamenting about their little oasis and what's happening to it. That decline happens and keeps going all the way until the 90s. When I was a young reporter in town covering crime, every spring, either a body or a car would get fished out of this thing. The neighbors, the residents, got together and said to the alderman and the others, Park District, which owns this, fix this thing up. And they did. They made an investment, which seems like peanuts now, around $3 million. The lake has been redone. New landscaping. Those new walls around the edges there, and there's an aerator at the far end you can see. And for the past 30 years, almost 28 years or so, it's been this uplifting asset to the community. Here's a thing that was a detriment to the community, and it ends up being an asset to it. And if you look at this photograph all the way to the right, there's a guy fishing, because they stock fish in there. And there's to the left, there's some guys gathered at the meeting place where they meet. So that's one example. The other example about what places that are less humanizing, I would say largely the public housing in Chicago, although most of the old school public housing is gone now. But that's one thing that clearly was built, I think, to dehumanize and to contain a population in their own neighborhoods, and now it's going away and being replaced by mixed income housing. We'll see. The jury is still out on, how good that'll be. But that's one example. Sorry for the long answer on the slide.
No, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. And we'd like to start with audience questions. And again, if you have a question for Libe, just enter it into the Q&A and we're happy to ask. I wanted to start off, Alex Bozakovich from the Globe and Mail up in Toronto who I guess is actually closer to you right now than he is to us. He said, well, first he starts off by thanking you for this. And he asks, how do you approach the task of describing the physical characteristics of a building or place, even though the language of architecture might not be familiar to most readers? How important is physical description?
Very, very much. I mean, and Alex, that's a great question. When I was writing about architecture the first time, I would, any metaphor that I could get my hands on that I thought would explain a building, I would talk about the building's arms, the building's face, the eyes, I would try to humanize the building, because that was one comparison that most people got. There's a building that's in my book called Pride Cleaners. It has a hyperbolic paraboloid roof. Well, you saw that, right? It has a hyperbolic paraboloid roof that's tilted. And I liken it, and I've written about it before, I've likened it to the tail fins of a Cadillac. People get that, right? So sometimes, and again, now, if I'm writing for Architect Magazine, I probably won't do that, right? I might use more formal descriptions because the audience is there. But I think for the everyday person who's picking up a newspaper or logging onto a site, whatever you can do without talking down to him, to help him bridge that gap, or her to bridge that gap, to explain what a place looks like, is fair game.
Cool.
Well, ask, just to play off on when you're talking about the role of the architecture critic and the role of the newspaper, of a general interest newspaper, in doing that. So what do you see the future as? What do you see the future of specifically architecture criticism? Do you see it more in lines of how you do it, in terms of mixing the politics and perhaps the social justice aspect of the built space? Or is it going to become more, I don't know. What do you think the future? I won't try to put words. Just tell me what you think. Where's it going to go, do you think?
Well, I think if it's going to have a life in newspapers, or in in general media, then it has to pick up these other aspects as well. Because it makes it relevant, right? If I tell you, there's a interesting project going on here in Chicago. A young lady named Tanika Johnson, who's has this really incredible but simple concept that she calls the folded map. And she's from the Inglewood community. And in Chicago, Chicago has long streets. So you could find a street 6300 South Ashland, and you can find 6300 North Ashland, and it's 120 blocks north, and it's a white neighborhood. And so she will begin to pick out the addresses, right, that are similar, and photograph the house on South, Low, and the one on North. There is no North Low, but anyway, you get it. And then she began to interview the people who were there. Interview the Inglewood resident, and the corresponding North Side resident at the same address, just north rather than south. And it's a simple concept, but it's done a lot to get people to kind of understand this kind of dichotomy that we're talking about. She's writing about buildings, right? And to some extent, she's writing about style of buildings because oftentimes, because those edges of the city were built at the same time, the buildings even look alike. You could tell originally. But through that window, she's able to say really profound things about race, racism, the way we socialize with each other. And this thing has been an exhibit. It should be a book, as I've been telling it. And but it's that kind of, I don't want to say trick, but it's that kind of thing, that kind of flip that I think has to be part of the mix. Architecture criticism can still say all the important things that the Ada Louise Huxtables and others said, but it needs to have this other piece ride along with it.
We have a Chicago question for you too, from our colleague Jermaine Barnes, who teaches down here at the University of Miami, but he's a native of the West Side, and he asks, historically, Chicago's West Side has been absent from prominent architectural discourse and popular culture. Any reason why your writing centers the South Side?
Yeah, a couple of good reasons. One is I'm a South Sider, right? And this is my end of the town. But he's absolutely right about the West Side being overlooked. There are references to the West Side, particularly I'm talking about the grander things in the book. I mean, I don't mean grand in terms of pretty. I'm talking about the larger themes of the book, where I am speaking specifically also about the West Side. But the reason how this ended up being a South Side book is that it was originally a South Side exhibit for the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2017. And I'm going to tell a story out of school, but I can tell it because who's going to hit me, right? When I came up with this idea for the exhibit, which was called Chicago: A Southern Exposure, I said at one of the meetings, the early meetings, and you should have someone shoot the West Side as well. And I was told, well, yeah, that's going to happen. So I thought, well, great, because a West Sider should get this, and then I could do the South Side, and there could be a companion piece on the West Side, and they'll be married. And while I'm doing the exhibit and also shooting for the exhibit, also laboring under the assumption that there's a West Side photographer doing the same thing I'm doing, I get to offer to write this book. So naturally, the book becomes a South Side book because that's where the exhibit is, and hopefully, whoever my West Side counterpart is, by not including the West Side in my book, I help his chances or her chances, right? The damn thing happens, the Architecture Biennial, and there's no West Side presence. And I was mad about that, and I brought that up. Not because I could have done it, because I could have at least incentivized somebody, help somebody else get it done, or push them to an exact person. So that's the reason why. In a perfect world, it would have been South and West Side. I got a good buddy from the it used to be a Better Boys Foundation, but it has another title now, who said, your next book should be Western Exposure. And they should do the West Side, which actually has a great title, doesn't it? So maybe, yeah. So that's the reason why.
That's great. I guess you can't really do Northern Exposure because you probably run into some copyright issues from that old television show. So we have another question from the audience. This is from a professor out in Savannah. This is Scott Singleson, and my apologies if I've butchered your name. I hope I got close. Mr. Bay, your story of arriving at architecture criticism is inspiring. Thank you for sharing this aspect of your development. Would you discuss the role of curiosity and observation in being a good writer and critic?
Oh, it's everything. And again, because when I began to write about architecture, I didn't have a background in architecture, so all I had was curiosity, right? Wait, what is that? Where does that go? Who did that? And what was great about it is that IIT and big firms like Helmet, like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and many of the great other firms, mid-sized firms in Chicago, were really good about letting me come in and look around and letting me ask all the stupid questions that I could ask in order to get the knowledge up. But curiosity is everything in this business. It leads you to obviously to more interesting questions. I mean, to go. Oftentimes, too much architecture criticism, and I don't want to name any names, but luckily it's no one that you have here on the set to speak between now and the 21st of October. But sometimes too much of it knows too much. It isn't surprised anymore. You know, it knows what it knows, and it doesn't go beyond that. And that to me is boring. I mean, when I read Inga Saffron's work, I mean, for instance, I mean, there is the quest for the question. There's a chase for the question, right? For the answer to the question, which makes her writing exciting to me. Same with Christopher when he was at the LA Times. If a critic knows it all, he's just writing, because from his strength and what he thinks he knows, boring. I want to, and maybe that's my old news side of me, but I want someone who can hit the streets, who can get some questions answered, who can pick up a phone and get a question answered. Doesn't presume to know the answer, but will make the calls to get the answer.
That's great. One question I had too was about all the different sources that you use in your research. So I've got a copy of Southern Exposure, and I should just say all of the critical acclaim is warranted. It's a really phenomenal book. And one of the things that I love about it is that I'm coming at it as an architect and a historian, and I love the way that you're using archival sources, you've got published histories, you've got all of that kind of evidence, but you've also got the personal stories. And I know about the cleaners because of your friends' stories of jumping off the roof on their BMX bikes and things like that. So you've got all these stories too from family, friends, some of the elders in the neighborhood. And it's such a fascinating mix of sources. And so I guess my question was, can you talk a little bit about how you identified source material for your book and why it was important to have such a range?
Well, and thank you for that question. When I realized and really realized, I mean, I knew that the South Side really hadn't been documented, but when I really saw how much it had not been documented, and that this book, really is the first architectural look at the city's South Side, then, I wanted to put everything into the mix that I could, right? I wanted to make sure that the people who live there were there. I wanted to, although, it's easier to do than in the old days, we had to look up microfilm and stuff, but I wanted to stitch together as many sources as I could about these buildings, because there really wasn't a source. Even Chicago Vocational High School, which you might recall, this giant Art Deco high school, the city's second largest high school. There was very little written about that at all. There was no book about it at all. So I'm threading my way through news stories that maybe give a little bit here. Here's where the foundations are laid. Here's the plan for it. But it's so the approach was much like old hip hop, when Hank Shockley and those guys and Bomb Squad used to make those early hip hop records, and they would sample a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It was a James Brown thing, and a horn, and a train, and this and that and that. I mean, it was kind of that approach, because there was no other way to kind of get at it. Stringing it together was tough. So I'll tell you this. So originally, when Northwestern University Press came to me about the book, I thought it was going to be a photo book only. So I really, I'd taken most of the photographs, and I had caption information, And then the reason why I won't let you guys see my room, because it's still filled with stuff from that book and bits and pieces of books and all kinds of stuff. So how to string the narrative together was tough. When they came to me and said, oh no, it's not going to be a book of captions and photographs. We need 20,000 words to go along with this. So I thought, oh my goodness. So then that's when I began to kind of stitch the quilt together, right? But then how to lay it all together, I've said this before, the inspiration was actually Goodfellas, the movie, and Nicholas Pileggi's book, Wise Guy, which once they got all this stuff together, right, all these histories, all these things, then I figure, then I'm the insider. I'm Henry Hill. I'm the insider showing you, the outsider, a world that you've never seen before. And in doing that, I'm going to show you, the guy who says, get the papers, get the papers. I'm going to show you, the guys I know. I'm going to show you, or that I've met along the way. I'm going to show you some historical records. Lufthansa heist is real, that kind of deal. And then stitch together that way. So it was really much that kind of approach, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Was there anything that you uncovered in that process that surprised you? Like because you're a lifelong resident in the South Side, were there things that you found really shocking that you didn't know?
Yeah, I didn't know the South Side was that big. I mean, I knew it. I mean, we all know the South Side is large. And I live on the far South Side. I live in the Pullman community, the historic landmark community. So I'm far out. So I'm conscious of the distance that it takes me to drive or take the train from downtown here. But the width of it, I really didn't know it was as big as Philadelphia. It wasn't until driving around and being around, I could think, gee, it's big. South Side is big. And then so that, but the size of it was the big thing. And I guess the other big surprise was I didn't really realize how much of a role that the South Side played with the World's Fair, development of the University of Chicago, the factories, the railroads, and making Chicago, right? It's like, with all the things that shaped modern Chicago, the roots of it don't go north, they come south. The stockyards, the political mechanism largely that's run Chicago for all these years, it all comes south. And that was to the extent of that was a surprise to me too.
Interesting. Yeah. In what way do you think that, is there a way, just building off of that as well, is there a way that the South Side epitomizes the struggles and the triumphs of the Black community in Chicago? In what way if so, in what way?
Very, very much so. I mean, Chicago for African Americans coming up from the South was the same as Ellis Island was for immigrants coming overseas, right? It was the promised land. When you got a glimpse of that old Illinois Central Station at Michigan and Randolph, it for most people was like seeing the torch of the Statue of Liberty, right? It was like, now that's where freedom and opportunity is. It isn't where I came from. Goodness knows it's not back there, but I can get a piece of it here. And as I mentioned in the book, imagine the excitement that you could catch an Illinois Central train from the deepest part of the South, deep, nasty, deep, nasty in terms of the way Blacks were treated, part of the South. And in a day, you could find yourself in Chicago, where you were in what was at the time the 9th largest economy in the world. And somewhere in there was a place for you. Somewhere in there, in the factories, that kind of thing. What happened, though, is something that is very cruel. And the book kind of gets into that, where African Americans find in Chicago and Cleveland's and other places, St. Louis even, and other places, a kind of de facto racism, or a kind of racism that's much like the racism in the South, although it's not written in books, right? And it begins to hamper, put a damper on what they're able to do. But yet, even in that, you could find, there were Black millionaires, everything from Ebony magazine to Soul Train to hair care products to the first Black person in the North sent to Congress. All that comes out of Chicago. So so to your question, the South Side is both those things. It can clamp you and keep you generationally in poverty, or it, or it can provide you opportunities that you couldn't find anyplace else. There's a reason why Barack Obama comes out of Chicago and not out of New York or not out of LA, because there's something in the mix here, right? That when you figure it out, when you figure it out, you can often sometimes succeed. The shame is you have to figure it out is a lifetime event for many people and for most of us, and very difficult to do. There are barriers there that should not be there, but there you go.
For sure. Well, we wanted to ask you, Lee, just as we're starting to wind this down, if you could tell us about what you're working on now, what you're writing, what you're photographing.
Good question. I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, part of me wants to do an expanded Southern exposure book, but that'll probably come in a couple of years, right? That book could have been twice as large and still not covered everything on the South Side, or still only scratched the surface. But I am concerned about religious structures. I mean, you can pick up a little bit of that in the book, that there's a funny thing happening here, even pre-COVID, where fewer people are going to church. Churches have, particularly in Black neighborhoods, there's a smaller aging congregation. Many of these buildings, are a century old, and I'm curious about the future of them. What's going to happen to them? On the north side of the city, where there's enough wealth, these buildings are being converted to residential places. A developer can pay a congregation and $2 million or whatever, and spend the sky's limit to put condos in it, because he knows by the time he gets the third condo sold, he's probably made his money back well on his way. On the south side, where the property values are so low, it's harder to make that happen. And so what's happening is that some of these churches slowly are beginning to vanish, to be demolished. And I think that that's going to keep on. And some of these places are just incredible, classic churches. So that's my concern. And I'm getting to sort of document them now. Maybe I'm gathering a string for another book in that regard.
Yeah.
That's great. And I would look so much forward to seeing that. I think that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about the impact of property values on churches. It's not something that I think many people would think a direct correlation between that. And I imagine a lot of those historically are fascinating, the design of the churches as well. And yeah.
They really are. I mean, they really are. I mean, just incredible churches. There's one in the book, but that I thought was going to be demolished. Actually, it's in the back of the yards community where the stockyards used to be, St. Gabriel's, and it's a beautiful church by Holoburton Root, I think it is, one of our star architects of the day. And the congregation is shrinking. It's the Catholic Church, and Archdiocese here will swing a bulldozer on the church in a minute. So I was really concerned about this church, but there must be 40 churches at least in the same amount of peril.
Wow. Yeah, what? We just got another question in from a Newton who says, thank you. Moving from analog to the digital age, when so much has changed in journalism and architecture, how has your own role as an architecture critic changed? Do you read cities differently than you did in the analog era?
Well, yes. I mean, great question. I mean, so the funny thing about it is, I left journalism in 2001, daily journalism, and then came back to it last year. So 20 years later, the world has changed. Although, again, I wrote for magazines along the way, but I hadn't been in the newsroom since then, not really. And so one thing that's good is that, I can show a lot more photographs digitally than I could before. Back then, it's like, writing for a newspaper, you had to help the photographer would shoot. You would pick the one part expression, the one money shot, the one photograph that summed up the building, when we both know that that's not the case. Now I can show 10 or 11. If there's a film, if there's a computer animation that shows what a building is going to look like, I can show that as well. So that's one thing. Has it changed? Yeah, it has changed how I see buildings, because knowing that I can tell you more about what I see, means a lot. For instance, one of the things that the book doesn't have that people have told me about is that people want a map of all those locations, but they don't want it in the book. They're like, give me a place where I can go to. And until we put that together, the publisher and I, people are taking on their own. They're going to Google Street View and other places, and they're doing it on their own. But but this is a kind of a technology where I know I can show this kind of thing, and readers, I can draw readers to that kind of thing. It does change how I see a building and the story that I'm going to tell about that building when I tell it to you.
Interesting. I wanted to ask you one other question, Lee, which is about the this kind of extraordinary community in Chicago of African-American artists and architects. There's just a really wonderful critical mass. The introduction to your book is by Amanda Williams, who's one of these people who's trained as an architect and practices as an artist. And there are other figures like Theaster Gates, who's originally from the West Side, but he's another one of these figures whose work sort of ranges between architecture and the arts. And I'm wondering how that inspires you as well, as you look at the built environment, how the work of these artists whose work sort of bumps up against architecture, how that inspires the way that you see architecture.
Well, you know, with Amanda's work in particular, which is why I wanted her to write the forward to the book, you know, she really got me to looking at buildings. She helped to get me looking at buildings in neighborhoods that weren't always the pretty building. I mean, for the book, those buildings are there, but in terms of how I see the city, in terms of future work that I'll do, or current work I'm doing at the Sun-Times now, you know, so you know, there's these humble, you know, 1.5 story old workers' flats from the teens and 20s. She paints them these wild colors as part of her color theory series, but she makes you look at those buildings in a way that these were just background buildings, background houses. These were the houses that were eyewash until you got to the big Queen Anne at the end of the block. But she makes you kind of look at them. With the Astor's work, and I worked with the Astor for 2 or 3 years at the University of Chicago before, you know, maybe after I left the Central Area Committee. And the Astor and I have known each other since before he got famous, actually. And you know, and his work, I wouldn't say it informs mine. I think that they're probably, you know, they're probably rooms or probably houses on the same block, right? You know, I mean, there's and I'm older than him, so I'm never going to say to the younger one, you know, but I think that, but the sense that there's something of value in these neighborhoods, architecturally, design-wise, that's worthy of looking at, worthy of saving, and worthy of reprogramming and reinterpreting. I think we're both kind of dipping our ladle in the same bowl in that regard. Yeah.
That's great. Well, you know what? I think we're gonna end on that question. But thank you, Lee, for a wonderful and informative evening. And stay tuned next week for Christopher Hawthorne of the City of Los Angeles, formerly of the LA Times. I guess that you call that my alma mater in a way. So I look forward to seeing him next week, all of you. And our thanks again to Lee Bay for being our guest this week. And again, I'm Dan Evans from the Department of Journalism at FIU.
And I'm David Rifkind from the Department of Architecture. And yes, thank you, Lee Bay. And we will see you all next week.
All right. Good night, everybody.